Hello, welcome back. Let me begin on lecture 4 for our series on maritime Buddhism. Happy to have you with us. The question arises as to whether there's anything which can be called maritime Buddhism, in the sense of whether there was a form of the religion developed in association with the sea that cannot be found elsewhere. The Atlas of Maritime Buddhism is not based on such premise. Instead, Buddhist development over the centuries and throughout the Great Circle is considered to have taken many forms, whether on the caravan routes or in the seaports. There was a common underlying base to Buddhist activities. Neither route created its own specific type. Our question is rather, in what way can such variety and multiplicity of Buddhist complexity be defined? Should the classifications be made in terms of geography or time or schools or practices? One attempt to deal with the formations can be spotted in this maritime world is to put them into 4 categories, with the full awareness that the categories often overlap and none describe a standalone version of the tradition. The 4 suggested types are early Buddhist practices, Mahayana, Tantra, and Reformed Theravada. The use of the term early Buddhism is meant to describe the tradition from its beginning as an organizational entity deserving the name Buddhism. It comes into existence after the passing away of Shakyamuni, when his followers created a recognized community in order to preserve his teachings. The founder himself was not a Buddhist, since the construction of this form of practice took place long after his cremation. For some time, this community was without sectarian divisions, but as it moved over a wider geographic range and lasted from generation to generation, the unity was threatened. Differences arose, and the records began to refer to the 18 schools of Buddhism. The actual number of schools cannot be easily determined, for there exist numerous or multiple listings where even larger numbers can be counted. Each school was organized in its own way, and not all became fully independent in terms of defining membership, residence options, and distinct rules of conduct. While lists of them are not identical, it became a convention to refer to 18. It was a way of speaking of all the varieties of practices that belonged to early Buddhism. The impact of the 18 schools was far-reaching. This era of the history of Buddhism was a time when debate arose over different ways of interpreting the remembered teachings of the founder. It was not so much a description of the fragmentation of the community as it was a reference to a time when the community began to explore beliefs and found multiple ways of describing reality and intentions. Now, much like a university, with diverse departments that focused on specific aspects of society and physical science. The 18 schools had a cohesion within Buddhism despite their differences. Some of them appeared among monks who lived in the same monastery, with those who held differing views about the doctrine and thought. None of these 18 has survived. We are left with fragments of their literature, some in Indic languages and others that were translated and preserved in Chinese. These teachings are still found scattered throughout the canons of Buddhist texts. It was a crucial part of the way in which Buddhism developed when there arose beliefs that were sometimes in direct conflict with the received beliefs of others. The 18 schools represented the era when Buddhism had to sort out multiple competing voices. In the 18, we find tolerance toward debate between differing ways of belief. The differences were not branded as heretic or punished for expressing a different point of view, but they were subject to open debate. The importance of the 18 is the fact that at the stage of early Buddhism, a rigorous critique of hundreds of ideas took place, and out of the arguments, consensus was reached on many of them. Buddhist thought was strengthened, and items which were not defensible tended to be weeded out in the discourses. The first resident monasteries in the world were celibates who lived by a strict set of rules of conduct, including common apparel, were Buddhist. As early as the 2nd century BCE, there is archaeological evidence in India for monastic structures. The rules of conduct, known as Vinaya, were transmitted through oral recitation and later written down. Textual evidence provides us with the storyline of how communities of men and women set themselves apart from normal society and over time formulated these rules of conduct required for the ones who chose to lead their lives in this fashion. The communities of those who came to be called monks and nuns shared a common style of living: shaven-headed, celibate, wearing special garments, giving up wealth, and begging each day for food. The initial phase of wandering ascetics gave way in Buddhism to an institutional framework. One of the major reasons for withdrawing from normal life was to live in the best way to achieve special states of awareness through days and months of concentration. However, these Buddhist monasteries developed not only as places for individual effort and spiritual growth, they became social institutions, physical campuses of buildings, and were central to the spread of the tradition. From its birthplace in the Gangetic Plain to the northeast India, and finally to the Great Circle of Buddhism. Monasteries of full-time residents required sizable funding for construction of buildings, food and clothing needed for a growing group of residents. It was necessary to have an institutional organization to handle the needs for such large numbers. Among the main supporters of these centers were rulers and merchants. As Buddhism spread across boundaries of kingdoms, merchant involvement was increased, and the monasteries played an important role in international trade. One aspect of the interaction between monastics and merchants was the use of monastic campuses for housing travelers, providing education for children, medical facilities, safekeeping of valuables, and spiritual protection from illness and safety from bandits. Along the trade routes of Central Asia, the monasteries became much like caravanserais in Persia, serving the needs of traveling merchants. The organization of spiritual practitioners who abandon normal life of householders may well be one of the greatest contributions that Buddhism has given to religious life. Centuries after Buddhist monasteries were firmly established throughout the Great Circle, similar practices started in the deserts along the Nile River in Egypt, 3rd and 4th century of the Common Era, among Christians. These individuals lived in caves and constructed cells, most as solitary practitioners. At the height of such activity, thousands of such sites dotted the deserts. In Palestine, there were first century precursors to these ascetics, such as the Essenes, who lived a life of poverty, celibacy, and obedience, and sought for spiritual perfection. They are thought to have been a splinter group from the Jewish Zadok priestly class. However, the first communal setting for Christian monastics is said to have been started by Pachomius, a Copt, in the 4th century of the Common Era at Thebes in Egypt. This was an important portal trade center where goods were being shipped on the Red Sea, including many from India, that were brought across the desert to be floated down the Nile. The communal monastic pattern of Pachomius spread to Palestine, Syria, and Mesopotamia. In these regions, the church was split into Jacobite, West Syria, and Nestorian, East Syria. This history gives us a strong suggestion that maritime merchants helped to bring the very idea of a monastery from India to Egypt, where it was spread as a major component of Christian practice. In a strange quirk of history, Christian monastic culture was carried by Nestorians back to Central Inner Asia, and from there on the rim of the Great Circle of Buddhism, it crossed over to China in the Tang Dynasty. This group is often depicted as a Christian heresy because its teachings about the nature of Christ were unacceptable to the council at Ephesus in 431. So as a result, the Nestorian Church has been seen as a minor splinter group. Well, in reality, it was for centuries the dominant tradition of Christianity in the eastern regions and occupied a position of great power. Another 3rd century tradition was that of Mani, whose movement, partly influenced by Christianity and Buddhism, was also taken along the trade routes through the Tarim Basin to China. Many of the Manichaean communal practices of living had taken their cue from the Buddhist monasteries in India. The Buddhist monastery pattern were significant social and religious factors in Eurasian history and international cultural exchange. A second part is the reverence for bodily relics, the remains of the founder after his cremation among laity, as well as monastics. This was expanded to include the relics of monks and nuns of high spiritual development. So another part of the Buddhist tradition that made its way throughout the Great Circle and also westward to Christianity was the veneration of relics. The practice of placing relics in a chamber and using them as an important part of ritual was a characteristic of early Buddhist practice. One of the ways in which the acts and words attributed to Shakyamuni differed from other Indian religious life concerned pollution fears. The Brahmanic priests were susceptible to pollution from travel, contact with strangers, even the shadow of out-of-caste people. These priests could not have moved around the Great Circle without losing their ritual purity, which would have made them powerless and unable to perform their major activities. Stories of Shakyamuni indicate that he was free of these pollution restraints. When he first left the householder life of a royal prince, with all its privileges, he took off his fine robes and tied together rags collected from dead bodies exposed in the open fields. Now, dead bodies are one of the strongest pollutants, so that using their clothing was a rejection of any idea that the dead could pollute him. If the followers of the Buddha were not susceptible to the negative power of dead bodies, they could handle and venerate bones and bodily fragments. The freedom from pollution extended beyond the bodily relics of the founder. Part of the success of Buddhism in its spread was the acceptance of contact with people of all walks of life, from kings to the lowest servants. Buddhists were not polluted by coming in contact with foreigners or low-status individuals. In many ways, early Buddhist communal life had its initial appearance as a relic cult. The death of Shakyamuni Buddha left the group with a host of problems, not the least of which was the question of whether they would be able to maintain a consistent practice and teaching over the years that followed his demise. While cremation marked the end of Shakyamuni's life. In another sense, it was the beginning of a new era. The bodily remains were seen to still contain the power of the Buddha because he achieved his enlightenment while alive in that human body. This enlightenment power still emanated from the relics, including objects that he had worn or touched during his life. At the moment of burning the body, the remaining bodily relics from the fire allowed the followers to feel that they still remained in touch with the presence of the Buddha after he had achieved final nirvana. Chief among the practices of the early community that continued to exist as an entity after the demise of Shakyamuni was the preservation, the housing, the veneration of these physical relics as objects still radiating the power of his enlightenment. Because the revered relics needed to be protected, the ancient system of mounding earth over the dead bodies was known and practiced by the early Buddhist group. The text references indicate that the appropriate site for such burial was at a crossroads. Now, roads were filled with the flow of people and goods from one location, but at the crossroads, there was an intermingling with travelers and goods and influences from many places. It was a place fraught with dangers arising from the intermingling of forces that were a part of the roads. So the placement of the stupa mound with the dead remains of an elite, whether royal or religious, at the crossroads could counter any disturbances or dangers that might occur at the crossing. Relics were portable. They could be carried to any place without losing their power. In this way, Buddhism had objects seen to contain great and useful power that could be enshrined at any spot on earth, and they could make that spot sacred. It is little wonder that stupas sprang up all over the landscape, not just at places that were considered sacred down through the centuries of time because of natural forces or events thought to have occurred on those sites. The relics carried their own sanctity, and for this reason were invaluable aids to the spread of Buddhism in places far distant from the original homeland. Across India, thousands of caves were decorated or constructed as an appropriate environment for early Buddhist practice. Because of the cost of carving out a large vault in a rock formation, caves required the wealth and power of kings, officials, or wealthy merchants. In some cases, groups of believers, such as merchants and artisan guilds, provided corporate donations that were sufficient to work on such vast projects. Inside the caves were carved stupa forms that indicated the importance of covering the relics of the structures covering the relics of the founder. Now, the hundreds of caves that dotted the landscape can, with some degree of accuracy, be dated. Often this is possible by either reference to inscriptions that name donors or by the style of construction. Many caves appeared during the 3 centuries before the Common Era, Natural caves and rock overhangs have been early sites for the wandering Shakyamuni and his followers, for them to find shelter, especially during the monsoon storms. In imitation of these havens for the founder and his companions, caves were excavated as traditional forms of housing for the ascetics and their rituals. The grandeur and the most decorated caves is an example of the affluent community transforming the humble rock shelters of the past into magnificent edifices. From the art found within these caves, we can document the introduction of portrait-like imagery depicting the human form of Shakyamuni. In the earliest caves, the stupa forms were bare of embellishments, including bare of any imagery of the likeness of the Buddha. But over time, the stupas became surfaces for decoration and finally places where the imagery of the Buddha's body began to appear. No longer were artisans limited to bare stupa forms. Instead, the Buddha image grew larger with each passing year until it became the dominant feature in the caves. The stupa became merely the canvas or the background on which to place it. The formerly bare walls of the stupas at the farther end of the chambers came to have more embellishments, and finally the full use of portrait-like images of the Buddha on their sides and domes. Through this process, we can witness and document the shift from relic to image. Today, most Buddhist structures house the Buddha image and those of his disciples and bodhisattvas. The Buddha Museum at Fo-Guang-Shan is a contemporary reflection of these ancient practices. It was built after the gift of an important relic to Master Xing Yun. He made sure to give due honor to the relic, and above it has constructed one of the world's largest seated Buddha images. The interplay between the image and relic is nowhere better illustrated than at the Buddha Museum. One of the major regions for caves that were tied to the maritime is to be found in the mountains, that is, the Ghats, that run parallel to the west coast of India. Hundreds of caves are located in these mountains. Many were constructed by merchants who were profiting from spices found in the forest, such as black pepper. Fortunes were being accumulated by those who were trading across the Indian Ocean to Africa and the Persian Gulf, with connections to the Mediterranean markets. Maritime merchants were the primary patrons for many of these caves along the west coast. Because of their role in the construction of the caves, it is not surprising to find that many of these excavated chambers on trading routes that led from the hinterland forest to the coast. Another aspect were the narrative art displays based on the life and activities of Shakyamuni. Art, both sculpture and paintings, became an important feature of stupa and cave construction. Visitors to these structures could be reminded of the life events of the Buddha by seeing depictions that brought them to mind. Such art was also a teaching strategy, whereby even those who were illiterate could know the significance of the place by seeing pictures of events. And that, after all, provided examples of the biographical story of the Buddha's life and kept alive his memory, and by extension, his activities. Now, art historians have identified stylistic differences of art, often starting with major Indian centers, where formations of images were local creations. The style of making such things as the image of the Buddha varied throughout the Great Circle, but the influences from India can be traced in many sites, and through this method, the spread of the tradition can be dated and special occurrences mapped. In the beginning of the Buddhist movement, there was no tradition of reading and writing. The words used for Shakyamuni's teaching could only be preserved by instituting the practice of reciting them, based on the memory of his close followers who had heard him deliver them. This oral tradition required reaching consensus about the correctness of the words as reflections of the teaching of the Buddha and setting in motion the memorization and recitation of them. One of the tasks of monastics was to acquire the ability to remember and chant the approved words. Scholars have long debated whether these preserved words and texts accurately match the spoken words of centuries in the past. We are left to question what has survived from the original events in the process of handing down the teachings of the founder. The Rig Veda was also an oral transmission, and it appears that the words have been saved in an unchanging fashion for hundreds of years. The Buddhist teachings were different in kind and use from the formulations of the ancient Vedic texts. However, there is proof that the oral tradition can transmit information in a stable form through the memory techniques of reciters. The maritime world of the Great Circle was dependent on written text, and thus what survives from the seaport era are manuscripts that became the source of the traditional teachings. These written documents changed an important part of Buddhism, since they replaced the ancient reliance on the orality of the memory. All of the things that we've been talking about today in this lecture are features of what we've called early Buddhism that appeared throughout the rim of the Great Circle. They are seldom given a corporate name, since for most Buddhists, these are just the fundamental elements of the tradition. The second of the forms of Buddhism to appear in the maritime world was Mahayana. Mahayana can be determined by the presence of a larger number of Buddhas, no longer limited to Shakyamuni and a list of 7 Buddhas plus a future one, a pantheon of exalted beings unmentioned in the early Buddhist teachings, development of written texts with a distinctive content, the dominance of images and structures for them. Tantra, while still connected to the Mahayana textual traditions such as the perfection of wisdom literature, introduced practices associated with the use of words in mantras and dharanis, associated with rituals of empowerment. After the councils held in Sri Lanka, Myanmar, and Thailand in the 14th and 15th centuries, a reformed practice and textual development appeared in South and Southeast Asia among the Theravada school. This was an attempt to focus on early Buddhist practices and teachings while removing Mahayana and Tantric aspects. Today, this is the dominant form of Buddhism in Sri Lanka and Southeast Asia mainland. So this is an overview of the Buddhist activities, an organization that appeared on the sea paths of the Great Circle. In future lectures, we'll address many of the complex features that characterize these four types. So thank you very much. Enjoyed being with you again. Look forward to seeing you for our next lecture.